For months, the most secretive intelligence agency in the world watched the most powerful man in Iran without him ever knowing. Somewhere inside the vaults of the CIA, an invisible clock was ticking, measuring not minutes, but movements. A convoy that left a compound 5 minutes later than usual, a light that stayed on in a private office 30 minutes longer than normal, a Friday sermon canceled without explanation. Each of those details was a clue, and together they would point to one morning in Tehran when the entire balance of power in the Middle East was about to be rewritten forever. This is the story of how the CIA tracked Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, for months, mapped his patterns, and then handed a single piece of intelligence to Israel that changed everything, the when and the where of a strike that would end his rule and trigger shockwaves across the world. It is a story about patience and obsession, about satellites and sources, and about people in windowless rooms making decisions that would decide who lives and who dies. Above all, it is a story about power and what it costs to use it. For decades, Khamenei had stood at the center of Iran's political and security system, the final authority on war and peace, on nuclear talks, on proxy wars stretching from Lebanon to Yemen. He survived sanctions, uprisings, cyber attacks, assassinations of his generals and scientists, and a constant shadow conflict with the United States and Israel. Inside the CIA, analysts had lived with his image on their screens and in their briefings for most of their careers, a permanent feature of the intelligence landscape rather than a solvable problem. But by early 2026, that began to change. A convergence of factors, Iran's nuclear advances, regional escalation, and a hardening stance in Washington and Jerusalem, turned the question from if he could ever be targeted to how and when. The CIA's involvement did not begin with a single bold order. It began, like most major operations, with paperwork, a request for deeper analysis of Iran's leadership resilience, a study of what would happen if Khamenei were suddenly removed from the picture. According to sources briefed on these assessments, the agency concluded that Iran's system would likely endure, possibly under even more hardline elements from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That conclusion may have made a decision easier for some policymakers. Eliminating Khamenei would be a massive shock, but not necessarily the end of the Islamic Republic. It would be a blow, not a collapse. At the same time, the CIA increased its focus on Khamenei's personal security and movement patterns. This was not entirely new. Western intelligence agencies had long tried to understand how he traveled, where he slept, which routes he favored, and which buildings he trusted the most. But now, the effort shifted into a higher gear. Analysts began pooling streams of information that normally lived in separate compartments, intercepted communications where his presence was hinted at indirectly, commercial satellite imagery showing reinforced security at certain sites on certain days, and open-source details about his public schedule, which often revealed more by what was canceled than by what was announced. The agency's challenge was not just to know where Khamenei was on a given day. It was to gain what one report later described as high fidelity on his location, a degree of confidence precise enough for a lethal strike. That meant building a pattern-of-life file that reached into the smallest routines: what kind of vehicle he used between compounds, how many decoy convoys were employed, when his security detail rotated shifts, how often key aides physically moved between his office and other power centers, like the Supreme National Security Council. Each tiny piece of data on its own was meaningless. Together, they were the outlines of vulnerability. Here's the question: how do you track one of the most protected leaders on Earth, inside one of the most guarded capitals in the world, without setting off alarm bells? Part of the answer lay in technology. According to media reports, U.S. and Israeli planners made use of advanced artificial intelligence tools to sift immense amounts of data, from satellite imagery to electronic signals, searching for patterns that human eyes might miss. Machine learning systems could flag anomalies, unusual activities at known leadership compounds, sudden security lockdowns at locations that were otherwise quiet, small but telling changes in traffic around sensitive buildings at certain hours. But technology alone was not enough. AI could highlight where to look. It could not tell the CIA what those patterns meant inside the opaque politics of the Iranian elite. That required people, human sources, human. Over years, Western intelligence agencies had tried to penetrate the networks around Iran's leadership with very limited success. The inner circle around Khamenei was fiercely loyal and deeply ideological, and the costs of betrayal were lethal. But the CIA did not need someone in the Supreme Leader's office to place a tracking chip on his desk. Instead, they could try to work further out in the system. Security personnel who noticed changes in deployment orders, bureaucrats who handled logistics for large meetings, technical staff who monitored secure communications infrastructure. Any one of them might see something that, when combined with satellite pictures and intercepted messages, revealed where and when Khamenei would be physically present. By early 2026, the pressure on everyone involved was rising. Israel and Iran had already exchanged serious blows, including strikes against Iranian nuclear and military targets and retaliatory missile attacks. Washington, under President Donald Trump's renewed administration, had embraced a more confrontational posture, supporting Israeli actions and approving direct U.S. involvement in some of the strikes. Inside the CIA, this translated into a clear mandate: provide the best possible intelligence picture of Iran's leadership to give U.S. and Israeli planners options, including, if circumstances allowed, a chance to hit the very top. That chance emerged gradually, not overnight. According to reporting that cited individuals familiar with the operation, the CIA spent months tracking Khamenei's movements across different locations, slowly gaining confidence about where he spent his time and how predictable his routines truly were. They noticed that certain high-level meetings tended to cluster in particular compounds, with enhanced security measures only visible from above or through electronic signatures. They observed that preparations for these gatherings left traces: additional communications traffic, more vehicles in off-street garages, short-term changes to air defense readiness near central Tehran. All of these signals fed into an evolving model of when a truly rare gathering of top leadership might be taking shape. Then came the breakthrough. The CIA learned that a leadership meeting of senior Iranian officials was scheduled for a Saturday morning at a compound in central Tehran, and that Khamenei himself was expected to attend. It was not just another briefing or religious ceremony. It was, according to the intelligence, a concentrated session of decision-makers, the kind that is held behind thick walls and closed gates, far from public view. Crucially, that specific time window aligned with other operational planning already underway in Israel and the United States. There was, suddenly, a narrow opening where Khamenei and several of his top officials would be in a single place at a known time. Originally, the joint operation had reportedly been considered as a nighttime strike, the traditional choice for surprise, precision, and reduced civilian presence on the streets. But once the CIA passed its new intelligence to Israel, Israeli planners reassessed the timing. A daylight strike, specifically timed to coincide with the leadership meeting at the Tehran compound, could offer something far more dramatic: the chance to decapitate much of Iran's senior leadership in one blow. It was a monumental shift in risk calculus. Daylight meant more exposure, more visibility, and more potential for miscalculation. It also meant the targets would be exactly where the intelligence said they would be at that precise hour. Inside situation rooms in Washington and Jerusalem, this created intense debate. Intelligence officers understood that even with high-fidelity reporting, nothing was guaranteed. A last-minute schedule change, a sudden health concern, or a security scare could cause Khamenei to skip the meeting or change locations without warning. Military planners worried about Iranian air defenses and the possibility of escalation spiraling beyond what political leaders believed they could control. Legal advisors raised questions about targeting a sitting head of state and what precedent it might set, even in the context of a long-running undeclared conflict. Every person around those tables knew that if the intelligence was wrong, the consequences would be disastrous, militarily, diplomatically, and morally. And yet, the operation moved forward. The CIA's role at this point was to keep refining and confirming its picture of the target environment up to the very last moment. Were the security patterns around the compound matching what previous high-level meetings had looked like? Were communications intercepts consistent with senior officials converging on that site? Did overhead imagery show the right vehicles, the right bodyguard formations, the right level of air defense readiness nearby? Each update that aligned with the model increased confidence. Each anomaly raised anxiety. The stakes, for the agency, were no longer just about providing intelligence. They were about owning the consequences of having provided it. What would you do if you were the analyst whose final assessment might decide whether a foreign leader lives or dies? On February 28, 2026, the operation reached its point of no return. Israeli forces, with U.S. support, launched a series of strikes across Tehran and other locations, targeting Iranian leadership structures. One of those strikes hit the leadership compound where Khamenei and other senior officials were meeting. The exact mechanics, the flight paths of the missiles, the penetration of Iranian defenses, the final seconds of those inside the building, remain largely outside public detail. But the outcome was clear enough. Iran's supreme leader was killed, along with other top figures of the regime. In Tehran, shock turned quickly into rage and grief. Iranian state media initially hesitated, then confirmed Khamenei's death and declared a prolonged mourning period. Crowds took to the streets, some in orchestrated displays of loyalty, others in chaotic, fearful gatherings, unsure of what would come next. The state vowed revenge. Missiles and drones were launched toward Israel and U.S. targets in the region, igniting exchanges that lit up radar screens and news broadcasts around the world. The IRGC, already powerful, moved rapidly to stabilize the system, asserting itself as the backbone of continuity in a moment of existential crisis. Inside the CIA, the atmosphere was different. Quieter, more controlled, but no less heavy. The operation, from an intelligence standpoint, had achieved its immediate objective. The high-confidence location data on Khamenei had enabled a successful strike. But success in intelligence is never clean. Analysts now had to assess second-order consequences. Who would replace him? How the IRGC would consolidate power? Whether Iran's missile forces would push the region toward a wider war. They also had to confront a more personal reality. The file they had built over months, the patterns of life, the schedule, the subtle behaviors that defined Khamenei's daily existence had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had turned a living person into a solvable targeting problem. As the dust settled, debates about the operation intensified far beyond the walls of the CIA and Mossad. Some policymakers and commentators framed it as a decisive blow against a regime that had fueled regional conflict and pursued nuclear capabilities. Others warned that killing the supreme leader might empower more radical factions, reduce chances for diplomacy, and entrench a siege mentality in Tehran that would last for years. Human rights advocates and legal scholars questioned the precedent of targeting a head of state in this way, even in a shadow war where the lines between battlefield and politics had long been blurred. Every side drew moral lessons from the same set of facts. For the intelligence community, the operation also became a case study in the new face of power. It showed how data, endless, granular, and often mundane, could be transformed into lethal opportunity when combined with advanced analytics, AI tools, and human judgment. It underscored how leadership targeting had evolved from tracking convoys in deserts to mapping behavior inside densely populated cities under the cover of normal life. And it reminded everyone involved that the most sophisticated systems in the world still rely on human decisions, human biases, and human willingness to bear responsibility. If you've stayed with this story to this point, you already know that these operations are not just about strategy and technology. They are about choices. On this channel, we dig into the hidden decisions that shape history and the people who make them. If you want to keep exploring how intelligence, power, and risk collide in moments like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. And tell me in the comments, in just a few words, do you think targeting a leader like this prevents war or makes it more likely? The legacy of February 28, 2026 is still being written. Iran's political system faces a future without the man who had guided it for more than 3 decades. Israel has demonstrated a willingness to reach into the heart of its greatest enemy's capital and strike at the very top, with U.S. partnership not just in weapons but in intelligence. The CIA, for its part, has shown the extent to which it can fuse technology, analysis, and covert access to shape events that once seemed untouchable. But each of those achievements carries a shadow. The knowledge that every escalation, however precise, creates new uncertainties and new grudges that will live on long after the names in today's headlines are gone. In the end, the story of how the CIA tracked Iran's supreme leader is not just a tale of spies and satellites. It is a mirror held up to our age, where information is power, and power can reach almost anywhere. The people inside those secure rooms made a judgment about what that power should be used for, and the world now has to live with the consequences. Somewhere, in another capital, another file is already being built, another pattern of life quietly charted, another window of opportunity slowly taking shape. And when that moment comes, someone will once again have to decide whether to open it or let it pass.